The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Atlanta as Detective Marcus Rivera adjusted his radio and stepped out of his patrol car. 3 weeks had passed since the first reports of violent attacks began trickling in from rural Georgia, and now the city felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. The CDC had issued vague warnings about a new strain of rabies, but Marcus knew something far more sinister was spreading through the population. His partner, Officer Jessica Thompson, emerged from the passenger side, her usually confident demeanor replaced by visible tension. They had been called to investigate another animal attack at Mercy General Hospital, the fourth such incident this week. As they approached the hospital's emergency entrance, Dr. Elena Rodriguez burst through the automatic doors, her scrubs stained with blood and her eyes wide with terror. She grabbed Marcus by the arm, her voice barely above a whisper as she explained that the victims they had brought in yesterday were no longer responding to treatment. In fact, they were no longer responding to anything at all, except for an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Inside the hospital, chaos reigned as medical staff tried to contain what appeared to be a coordinated outbreak of violence among patients. Marcus watched in disbelief as an elderly man who had been pronounced dead an hour earlier stumbled down the hallway, his movements jerky and unnatural, his clouded eyes fixed on a terrified nurse. The man's jaw hung slack, and a low, guttural moan escaped his throat as he reached toward the woman with decomposing fingers. Jessica immediately radioed for backup while Dr. Rodriguez explained that 17 patients had exhibited similar symptoms over the past 48 hours, complete brain death followed by reanimation with aggressive, predatory behavior. The doctor's hands shook as she described how traditional sedatives and restraints had proven completely ineffective, and how several staff members had already been injured trying to subdue the affected individuals. Across town, military contractor and former Navy SEAL David Washington was conducting a routine security assessment at the Atlanta Federal Building when his encrypted phone buzzed with an emergency alert from his Pentagon contact. The message was brief but chilling: biological containment failure. All civilian authorities compromised. Initiate Protocol 7 immediately. David had spent 15 years in special operations and had seen his share of classified threats, but Protocol 7 was reserved for only the most catastrophic scenarios, those involving potential extinction-level events. He quickly gathered his tactical gear from his vehicle and began making his way toward the predetermined extraction point, knowing that his survival training would be put to the ultimate test in the coming hours. Meanwhile, in the suburban community of Brookhaven, high school biology teacher Amy Chen was dismissing her afternoon class when screams erupted from the adjacent hallway. Through her classroom window, she watched in horror as several students and faculty members fled from what appeared to be a coordinated attack by individuals who moved with the same unnatural, predatory behavior that Dr. Rodriguez was witnessing at the hospital. Amy immediately locked her classroom door and gathered the 12 students who remained, including star athlete Tommy Martinez and honor student Rebecca Foster, both of whom looked to her for guidance as the sounds of violence grew closer. The school's intercom system crackled to life with Principal Johnson's voice, but his words were cut short by inhuman screaming and the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. As emergency services across the city became overwhelmed by simultaneous outbreaks, a small group of survivors began to emerge from the initial chaos. At the hospital, Marcus and Jessica had managed to evacuate Dr. Rodriguez and several other medical personnel to the hospital's secure wing, where they barricaded themselves while trying to understand the scope of the crisis. The detective's military background proved invaluable as he organized the group's defenses and established communication protocols with other survivors throughout the city. Dr. Rodriguez worked frantically to analyze blood samples from the affected patients, hoping to identify the pathogen responsible for the outbreak, while Jessica maintained contact with dispatch and coordinated with other law enforcement units still operational. The infected individuals, or zombies, as the survivors had begun calling them, displayed a disturbing level of coordination that suggested the pathogen affected not just individual behavior but also created some form of collective intelligence. They moved in groups, seemed to communicate through their haunting moans, and showed an alarming ability to problem-solve when pursuing their prey. Traditional zombie mythology suggested mindless, shambling creatures, but these beings retained enough cognitive function to open doors, climb stairs, and even use simple tools to break through barriers. Dr. Rodriguez's preliminary analysis revealed that the pathogen attacked the higher brain functions while leaving the primitive areas intact, essentially reducing humans to their most basic predatory instincts while maintaining their physical capabilities and adding an insatiable hunger for living tissue. As night fell over Atlanta, the city's emergency broadcast system transmitted its final message before going silent, warning all citizens to seek immediate shelter and avoid contact with anyone displaying symptoms of the mysterious illness. The message confirmed what the survivors already suspected: this was no ordinary disease outbreak, but rather the beginning of a fight for humanity's very survival against an enemy that had once been human themselves. The first night of the outbreak tested every survivor's resolve as the infected numbers swelled exponentially across Atlanta. At Mercy General Hospital, Marcus Rivera discovered that the building's security systems had been compromised when several zombies managed to breach the supposedly secure wing by following the scent of living humans through the ventilation system. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been working tirelessly to understand the pathogen when a group of reanimated patients broke through the reinforced doors of the medical laboratory, forcing the survivors to flee to the hospital's rooftop. From their elevated position, they could see the true scope of the catastrophe unfolding below. Entire city blocks were now overrun with the infected, and fires burned unchecked as emergency services collapsed under the overwhelming crisis. Jessica Thompson used her police radio to establish contact with other survivor groups, learning that similar outbreaks had simultaneously erupted in major cities across the southeastern United States, suggesting a coordinated biological attack rather than a natural epidemic. The radio chatter revealed that military units were being deployed, but early reports indicated that conventional weapons were proving ineffective against enemies that felt no pain and could only be stopped by massive trauma to the brain stem. Meanwhile, David Washington had successfully reached the federal building's emergency bunker, where he discovered a cache of military-grade equipment and classified documents that painted a terrifying picture of the outbreak's true origins. According to the files, a rogue research facility had been developing biological weapons designed to create controllable super soldiers, but the project had gone catastrophically wrong when test subjects began exhibiting the zombie-like symptoms now spreading across the population. The documents revealed that the pathogen was engineered to be highly contagious through bodily fluids and could reanimate dead tissue within hours of infection, creating an army of nearly indestructible enemies that retained enough intelligence to coordinate attacks while losing all human compassion and empathy. David realized that the government's contingency plans had failed, and that survival now depended on ordinary citizens banding together to fight an enemy that conventional military tactics couldn't defeat. At Brookhaven High School, Amy Chen had managed to keep her group of students alive by using her knowledge of the building's layout to guide them through maintenance tunnels and hidden passages that the zombies hadn't yet discovered. Tommy Martinez proved invaluable with his athletic ability, helping to move heavy objects to create barricades, while Rebecca Foster used her technological skills to hack into the school's communication system and establish contact with other survivor groups throughout the city. The students had witnessed their friends and teachers being transformed into mindless predators, creating a psychological trauma that Amy struggled to help them process while simultaneously planning their escape from the increasingly dangerous school environment. Through the school's security cameras, they watched in horror as the infected systematically searched every room and corridor, displaying an organizational ability that suggested they were learning and adapting their hunting strategies. As dawn approached, the scattered survivor groups began to recognize that their individual strongholds were becoming death traps, and that their only hope for long-term survival lay in joining forces to create a larger, more defensible community. Dr. Rodriguez had made a breakthrough in her analysis of the pathogen, discovering that the virus required a specific protein found only in living brain tissue to continue replicating, which explained the zombies' singular focus on consuming human heads and their apparent ability to sense living humans from considerable distances. Her research also revealed a potential weakness: the virus was vulnerable to extreme temperatures, suggesting that fire or freezing could potentially slow or stop the infection process, though this knowledge came too late to help the millions already affected. Marcus Rivera coordinated the first successful multi-group communication network, connecting the hospital survivors with David Washington's federal bunker team and Amy Chen's school group, as well as several other small communities of survivors scattered throughout the metro area. The plan that emerged from their desperate collaboration involved a dangerous nighttime evacuation from their individual locations to a centralized meeting point at the Georgia World Congress Center, which offered the defensive advantages of limited access points, extensive food storage, and backup power systems. However, the journey would require each group to traverse several miles of zombie-infested city streets, with no guarantee that their destination hadn't already been overrun by the infected hordes. The psychological toll of the outbreak became evident as survivors struggled with the knowledge that their loved ones, friends, and neighbors had become their deadliest enemies, creating moral dilemmas about whether the zombies retained any trace of their former humanity and deserved mercy or whether they had become purely predatory monsters that needed to be destroyed without hesitation. Tommy Martinez broke down when he recognized his younger sister among a group of infected students, forcing Amy Chen to make the agonizing decision to prevent him from trying to save someone who was already lost to the virus. These emotional conflicts threatened to tear apart the fragile alliances forming between survivor groups, as different people coped with trauma in ways that sometimes put the entire community at risk. By the second morning, it became clear that the zombie outbreak had evolved beyond a simple infection into a new form of warfare between two species competing for dominance of the planet, with the infected showing signs of developing rudimentary communication systems and tactical coordination that made them increasingly dangerous opponents. The survivors realized they were no longer fighting for rescue or a return to normalcy, but rather for the fundamental right of humanity to continue existing in a world where death was no longer permanent and the rules of civilization had been permanently shattered. The evacuation from Mercy General Hospital began under cover of darkness, with Marcus Rivera leading Dr. Rodriguez, Jessica Thompson, and 8 other survivors through the building's abandoned corridors toward the parking garage. The zombies had learned to distinguish between the sounds of the living and the dead, forcing the group to move with painstaking silence while navigating around clusters of infected that had gathered near the hospital's main entrances. Dr. Rodriguez carried her research samples in a modified medical cooler, knowing that her discoveries about the pathogen's vulnerabilities might be humanity's only hope for developing an effective countermeasure. The parking garage proved to be a nightmare scenario, with dozens of zombies trapped inside the concrete structure, their moans echoing off the walls as they responded to the survivors' presence with increasing agitation. Marcus made the difficult decision to use precious ammunition to clear a path to their vehicles, knowing that the gunshots would attract every infected creature within a 6-block radius but having no alternative if they hoped to reach the rendezvous point alive. David Washington's journey from the federal bunker required a different approach, as his military training allowed him to move through the infected zones using stealth and tactical precision rather than brute force. He had equipped himself with night vision goggles, suppressed weapons, and military-grade body armor from the bunker's armory, but even with these advantages, the sheer number of zombies roaming the streets forced him to take an indirect route that added several hours to his travel time. The classified documents he carried revealed additional disturbing information about the outbreak's origins. The pathogen had been designed with a secondary activation phase that would occur approximately 72 hours after initial infection, potentially granting the zombies enhanced physical capabilities and even more sophisticated cognitive functions. This meant that the relatively manageable threat they were currently facing would soon evolve into something far more dangerous, making their window for establishing a defensible stronghold critically narrow. At Brookhaven High School, Amy Chen's group faced the most perilous extraction, as they had no vehicles and would need to travel on foot through residential neighborhoods that had become hunting grounds for roving packs of infected. Rebecca Foster had managed to map out a route using traffic cameras and security feeds from nearby businesses, identifying several safe houses where they could rest and resupply during their journey to downtown Atlanta. Tommy Martinez struggled with survivor's guilt after being forced to abandon his infected sister, but his athletic abilities and knowledge of the local area made him an invaluable scout for the group as they navigated through backyards, drainage tunnels, and abandoned buildings. The students had fashioned makeshift weapons from school supplies and sports equipment, but their inexperience with violence made every encounter with zombies a life-threatening ordeal that tested their courage and resolve. The first major setback occurred when Marcus Rivera's hospital group encountered a massive horde of zombies that had congregated around a crashed emergency broadcast truck, apparently drawn by the vehicle's still functioning loudspeakers. The zombies had formed an organized perimeter around the truck, with some acting as sentries while others systematically searched nearby buildings for survivors, demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that contradicted everything the survivors thought they knew about the infected. Dr. Rodriguez observed that the zombies near the truck displayed more advanced motor skills and coordination than those they had encountered at the hospital, suggesting that prolonged exposure to the pathogen was enhancing rather than degrading their cognitive abilities. This discovery forced the group to abandon their original route and seek shelter in an abandoned department store, where they would wait for the horde to disperse before attempting to continue their journey. David Washington reached the Georgia World Congress Center first, using his military expertise to conduct a thorough reconnaissance of the facility before establishing a secure perimeter. He discovered that the building had already been partially overrun by zombies, but that the upper levels remained accessible and defensible with proper fortification. The center's extensive food court and storage areas contained enough supplies to sustain a large group of survivors for several weeks, while the building's robust construction and limited access points made it an ideal fortress against zombie attacks. However, David also found evidence that other survivor groups had attempted to use the facility as a refuge, only to be overwhelmed by coordinated zombie assaults that suggested the infected were capable of siege tactics and long-term strategic planning. Amy Chen's group suffered their first casualty when one of the students, Kevin Murphy, was separated from the main group during a panicked flight from a zombie ambush in a residential area. Despite Tommy Martinez's desperate attempt to rescue him, they were forced to watch helplessly as Kevin was overwhelmed by infected neighbors who had once been his friends and family members. The psychological impact of losing one of their own shattered the group's remaining illusions about the possibility of saving everyone, forcing Amy to make increasingly difficult decisions about when to fight and when to flee. Rebecca Foster's technological skills proved crucial when she managed to hack into the city's emergency alert system, broadcasting a message to other survivors about their planned rendezvous while simultaneously jamming zombie communication frequencies that she had detected during her electronic surveillance. As the three groups converged on downtown Atlanta, they began to understand that the zombie outbreak represented more than just a biological disaster. It was an evolutionary event that was rapidly creating a new dominant species capable of learning, adapting, and ultimately replacing humanity as the planet's apex predator. The survivors realized that their fight was no longer about waiting for rescue or finding a cure, but about proving that human intelligence, cooperation, and determination could triumph over an enemy that possessed superior numbers, enhanced physical capabilities, and an apparently inexhaustible drive to hunt and consume the living. The Georgia World Congress Center became a beacon of hope and terror as the three survivor groups finally converged after their harrowing journeys through zombie-infested Atlanta, but their relief at reaching the designated rendezvous point was quickly overshadowed by the discovery that the infected had followed them and were now surrounding the building in unprecedented numbers. David Washington's military reconnaissance had prepared him for many scenarios, but the sight of nearly 1,000 zombies moving with coordinated precision around the center's perimeter defied everything he understood about the enemy they were facing. Dr. Elena Rodriguez immediately began analyzing the behavior patterns she observed through the building's security cameras, noting that the zombies had organized themselves into distinct groups with specific functions. Some patrolled the entrances while others systematically tested the building's structural weaknesses, and a third group appeared to be communicating through a complex series of vocal signals that suggested they were developing their own primitive language. Marcus Rivera took charge of organizing the combined survivor groups, drawing on his law enforcement experience to establish security protocols and assign responsibilities, while Jessica Thompson coordinated communication efforts and Amy Chen focused on the psychological well-being of the younger survivors who were struggling to process the trauma of losing friends and family members to the infection. The reality of their situation became even more dire when Rebecca Foster's electronic surveillance equipment detected radio transmissions from military units attempting to establish quarantine zones around major population centers, but the communications revealed that conventional military tactics were proving ineffective against enemies that felt no pain, required no rest, and could coordinate attacks with a level of strategic thinking that surpassed many human military operations. Tommy Martinez had thrown himself into physical preparations for the group's defense, using his athletic abilities to help David Washington fortify the building's access points and establish escape routes, but the young man's grief over his sister's transformation continued to manifest in increasingly reckless behavior that threatened to compromise the entire group's safety. Dr. Rodriguez made a disturbing discovery when she analyzed blood samples from zombie corpses that David had collected during his reconnaissance. The pathogen was continuing to evolve within the infected hosts, creating new strains that enhanced different aspects of zombie physiology, including improved motor coordination, enhanced sensory perception, and most alarmingly, increased brain activity in regions associated with problem-solving and strategic planning. As the 72-hour mark approached since the initial outbreak, the survivors witnessed the beginning of the pathogen's secondary activation phase that David's classified documents had warned about, and the transformation was far more dramatic than anyone had anticipated. The zombies surrounding their building began exhibiting behaviors that could only be described as tactical innovation. They started using tools to breach barricades, coordinating multi-pronged attacks on different entrances simultaneously, and even demonstrating the ability to learn from failed assault attempts by modifying their strategies in real time. Amy Chen watched in horror as infected individuals who had once been her students displayed problem-solving abilities that rivaled those of the human survivors, using their knowledge of the building's layout to identify vulnerabilities that David Washington's military training had overlooked. The psychological impact on the survivors was devastating, as they realized they were no longer fighting mindless monsters but rather a new form of intelligent life that retained human knowledge while being driven by an alien hunger for living flesh. The first major test of the survivors' defenses came when a group of enhanced zombies managed to breach the building's loading dock by working together to operate heavy machinery, demonstrating not only tool use but also the ability to understand and manipulate complex mechanical systems. Marcus Rivera led a desperate counterattack with David Washington and Tommy Martinez, but they discovered that the enhanced zombies were significantly stronger and faster than their predecessors, requiring multiple headshots to eliminate and showing tactical awareness that made traditional combat strategies ineffective. Dr. Rodriguez realized that the pathogen was essentially accelerating human evolution in a terrifying direction, creating beings that retained the intellectual capabilities of their former selves while being reprogrammed with a singular drive to hunt and consume the uninfected. Jessica Thompson's communication efforts revealed that similar transformations were occurring in zombie populations across the country, with reports of infected individuals using vehicles, operating equipment, and even attempting to communicate with human survivors through written messages that conveyed nothing but threats and demands for surrender. The survivors' unity was tested when philosophical differences emerged about how to respond to the evolving threat, with some members advocating for aggressive preemptive strikes against zombie concentrations while others believed their only hope lay in finding a way to communicate with the enhanced infected and potentially negotiate some form of coexistence. Amy Chen found herself mediating between David Washington's military approach, which emphasized eliminating the zombie threat through superior firepower and tactics, and Dr. Rodriguez's scientific perspective, which focused on understanding the pathogen well enough to potentially reverse or control its effects. Rebecca Foster's technological expertise became crucial when she discovered that the enhanced zombies were using electronic devices to coordinate their attacks, suggesting that they had retained enough human knowledge to operate communication equipment and potentially access information systems that could compromise survivor-safe houses throughout the region. The night brought a coordinated assault that tested every aspect of the survivors' preparations, as enhanced zombies attacked the Georgia World Congress Center from multiple directions while using diversionary tactics and feints that demonstrated military-level strategic thinking, forcing the human defenders to confront the terrifying reality that they were no longer the dominant intelligence on their own planet. The coordinated zombie assault on the Georgia World Congress Center began at precisely midnight, with enhanced infected launching simultaneous attacks on 4 separate entry points while a fifth group created a massive distraction by setting fire to nearby buildings, their newfound intelligence allowing them to understand that smoke and chaos would compromise the survivors' ability to coordinate their defense. David Washington found himself fighting enemies that moved with military precision, using hand signals to communicate and employing flanking maneuvers that demonstrated they had retained not only their human memories but also any military or tactical training they possessed before infection. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched in fascination and terror as enhanced zombies used crowbars and sledgehammers with deliberate technique rather than mindless aggression, their movements calculated and efficient as they systematically dismantled the barricades that had taken hours to construct. Marcus Rivera coordinated the defense from the building's security center, but the enhanced zombies had learned to avoid areas covered by security cameras, suggesting they understood the concept of surveillance and were actively working to counter human advantages. Jessica Thompson maintained radio contact with other survivor groups across the city, receiving increasingly desperate reports of coordinated attacks that indicated the enhanced zombies were implementing a citywide strategy to eliminate all remaining human resistance in a single, overwhelming offensive. Amy Chen found herself protecting the younger survivors while simultaneously trying to analyze the zombies' behavioral patterns for weaknesses that could be exploited, noting that the enhanced infected still displayed certain limitations in their cognitive processing that suggested the pathogen's improvements came with corresponding deficits in other areas. Tommy Martinez had overcome his grief-driven recklessness and emerged as a natural leader among the younger survivors, using his knowledge of urban parkour to establish escape routes through the building's ventilation systems and emergency passages that even David Washington's military training hadn't considered. Rebecca Foster's technological expertise proved invaluable when she discovered that the enhanced zombies were vulnerable to certain electromagnetic frequencies that disrupted their coordination abilities, leading her to improvise a weapons system using the building's public address equipment and emergency broadcast transmitters. The battle raged for 3 hours, with human defenders forced to retreat deeper into the building as enhanced zombies demonstrated problem-solving abilities that allowed them to adapt to each defensive strategy within minutes of encountering it, learning from their failures and sharing that knowledge with other infected through their primitive but effective communication system. The turning point came when Dr. Rodriguez made a critical observation about the enhanced zombies' behavior during combat. Despite their improved intelligence and coordination, they still required direct visual contact with their targets to maintain focus, suggesting that their enhanced cognitive abilities came at the cost of reduced sensory processing in other areas. This discovery led to a desperate gambit where the survivors used the building's fire suppression system to flood key areas with dense smoke, creating conditions where human defenders with flashlights and night vision equipment could operate more effectively than zombies whose enhanced intelligence couldn't compensate for their compromised vision. David Washington led a counterattack that exploited this weakness, using smoke grenades and strobing emergency lights to confuse and disorient the enhanced zombies while Marcus Rivera and Tommy Martinez secured the building's critical infrastructure points. Amy Chen coordinated the evacuation of non-combatant survivors to higher floors while Dr. Rodriguez worked frantically to synthesize her research findings into practical countermeasures that could be implemented using materials available in the building's medical facilities and maintenance areas. As dawn approached, the survivors realized they had won a crucial battle but that the war was far from over, with Rebecca Foster's electronic surveillance revealing that enhanced zombie groups throughout Atlanta were analyzing the failed assault and developing new strategies based on what they had learned from the encounter at the Georgia World Congress Center. The psychological toll of fighting enemies who retained human intelligence while possessing inhuman motivations pushed several survivors to their breaking points, forcing Amy Chen to address growing concerns about the long-term sustainability of human resistance against an enemy that could learn and adapt faster than conventional military forces. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis of tissue samples collected during the battle revealed that the pathogen was continuing to evolve, with each generation of infected showing improvements over their predecessors in terms of cognitive function, physical capabilities, and resistance to traditional weapons and countermeasures. Jessica Thompson's communication network brought disturbing news from other survivor groups, reporting that enhanced zombies were beginning to use vehicles, operate complex machinery, and even attempt to repair damaged infrastructure to support their own strategic objectives. The survivors faced a grim realization that their victory at the Georgia World Congress Center represented only a temporary reprieve in a conflict that was rapidly evolving beyond anything they had prepared for, with enhanced zombies demonstrating capabilities that suggested they were developing their own civilization and technology while maintaining their fundamental drive to eliminate all uninfected humans. David Washington's military experience provided tactical advantages in individual battles, but the strategic implications of fighting an enemy that could learn from every encounter and share that knowledge instantaneously across vast networks of infected individuals created challenges that no conventional warfare doctrine had ever addressed. The morning brought new intelligence about zombie behavior that would force the survivors to completely reconsider their assumptions about the nature of their enemy and their chances for long-term survival in a world where the boundary between human and monster was becoming increasingly blurred. The morning after the successful defense of the Georgia World Congress Center brought a sobering assessment of their situation, as Dr. Elena Rodriguez's analysis of the battlefield revealed that the enhanced zombies had deliberately left behind certain corpses as a form of biological weapon, with the bodies containing concentrated doses of an airborne variant of the pathogen that could potentially infect survivors through respiratory exposure. David Washington immediately implemented emergency quarantine protocols, sealing off contaminated areas and establishing decontamination procedures, but the discovery that the zombies were capable of such sophisticated chemical warfare tactics fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict from a simple battle for survival to a complex chess match between two intelligent species. Marcus Rivera found himself grappling with command decisions that would have challenged seasoned military leaders, as traditional rules of engagement became meaningless when fighting enemies who retained human intelligence while being driven by alien motivations that made negotiation or surrender impossible. Rebecca Foster's monitoring equipment detected disturbing patterns in zombie communication frequencies, indicating that the enhanced infected were not only sharing tactical information but also developing what appeared to be cultural practices and social hierarchies that suggested they were evolving into a genuine alternative civilization rather than remaining simple predators. Amy Chen struggled to maintain morale among the younger survivors as the reality of their situation became increasingly clear. They were not fighting for rescue or a return to normalcy, but rather for the fundamental right of humanity to continue existing on a planet that was rapidly being claimed by a new dominant species. Tommy Martinez had channeled his grief and anger into becoming an exceptional fighter and strategist, but Amy worried about the psychological cost of transforming traumatized teenagers into hardened warriors capable of killing creatures that had once been their friends and neighbors. Dr. Rodriguez made a breakthrough when she discovered that the pathogen's evolution was not random but followed predictable patterns based on the host's pre-infection knowledge and skills, meaning that zombies created from doctors, engineers, and military personnel would possess enhanced capabilities specific to their former professions. This revelation explained why the enhanced zombies were displaying such sophisticated tactical abilities and suggested that the threat would continue to escalate as more professionals and specialists succumbed to infection, creating specialized zombie variants with expertise in areas ranging from electronic warfare to biological weapons development. Jessica Thompson's communication network brought increasingly dire reports from other survivor groups, revealing that enhanced zombies were beginning to establish permanent settlements in conquered territory, constructing crude but effective fortifications and organizing supply chains to support their growing populations. The infected were not simply consuming human flesh but were also harvesting materials and resources needed to support their emerging civilization, suggesting long-term planning capabilities that contradicted every assumption about zombie behavior based on popular culture and early outbreak observations. David Washington recognized that conventional military tactics would be insufficient against enemies who could learn and adapt as quickly as their human opponents, leading him to develop unconventional strategies that emphasized mobility, stealth, and psychological warfare rather than direct confrontation. The survivors realized they needed to transition from defensive survival to offensive operations if they hoped to prevent the enhanced zombies from consolidating their territorial gains and establishing an unbreakable foothold in human civilization. The discovery of zombie agriculture marked a turning point in the survivors' understanding of their enemy, as Rebecca Foster's drone surveillance revealed infected individuals cultivating crops and raising livestock in areas they had conquered, demonstrating not only advanced planning capabilities but also the intention to create a sustainable society rather than simply consuming all available resources. Dr. Rodriguez's research suggested that the pathogen was somehow enabling rapid skill acquisition and knowledge transfer between infected individuals, allowing zombies with no previous agricultural experience to develop farming techniques through some form of collective learning process that defied conventional understanding of how knowledge and skills were acquired and transmitted. Amy Chen found herself confronting ethical questions about whether the enhanced zombies deserved consideration as a legitimate species with rights to territory and resources, or whether they remained an existential threat that needed to be eliminated regardless of their developing intelligence and civilization. Tommy Martinez advocated for aggressive action against zombie settlements, arguing that allowing the infected to establish permanent colonies would make eventual human victory impossible, while other survivors worried about the moral implications of what would essentially amount to genocide against beings who had once been human. Marcus Rivera organized reconnaissance missions to gather intelligence about zombie capabilities and intentions, but these operations revealed that the enhanced infected were also conducting surveillance on human survivors, suggesting that both species were engaged in the same strategic planning processes and intelligence-gathering activities that characterized conventional warfare between human nations. The psychological pressure of fighting an enemy that mirrored their own tactical thinking while possessing superior numbers and physical capabilities began to take its toll on even the most resilient survivors, forcing Amy Chen to address growing concerns about depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation among group members who saw little hope for long-term survival. Dr. Rodriguez's latest research indicated that the pathogen was approaching a third evolutionary phase that would likely grant the enhanced zombies capabilities that could make human resistance futile, creating an urgent timeline for any decisive action the survivors hoped to take against their increasingly sophisticated enemies. The evening brought reports of zombie diplomatic missions attempting to establish contact with isolated human settlements, offering terms of surrender that included guaranteed survival for humans willing to submit to infected authority, a development that shattered the survivors' remaining assumptions about the nature of their enemy and forced them to confront the possibility that they were fighting not monsters but representatives of humanity's evolutionary successor. The zombie diplomatic missions represented a paradigm shift that divided the survivor community more deeply than any previous crisis, as intercepted communications revealed that the enhanced infected were offering detailed terms of surrender that included provisions for human breeding programs, work assignments based on pre-infection skills, and even limited self-governance within designated territories under zombie oversight. David Washington viewed these diplomatic overtures as psychological warfare designed to weaken human resolve, but Dr. Elena Rodriguez argued that the sophisticated nature of the proposals indicated genuine intelligence and planning capabilities that demanded serious consideration, even if acceptance remained unthinkable. Marcus Rivera found himself mediating increasingly heated debates between survivors who saw negotiation as a potential path to survival and those who viewed any accommodation with the infected as a betrayal of human dignity and the memory of those who had already died fighting the outbreak. Amy Chen struggled to counsel younger survivors who were beginning to question whether continued resistance was worth the constant terror and loss, especially as reports filtered in of other human groups accepting zombie terms and apparently surviving under the new regime, though the long-term consequences of such arrangements remained unknown and potentially horrific. Rebecca Foster's electronic surveillance equipment captured zombie broadcasts that revealed the enhanced infected were not only communicating with human settlements but were also engaging in complex negotiations with each other, establishing territorial boundaries and trade agreements that demonstrated political sophistication rivaling that of human governments. The discovery that different zombie factions had developed distinct ideologies and approaches to dealing with surviving humans created both opportunities and dangers for the Atlanta survivors, as some infected groups advocated for human extinction while others supported various forms of coexistence or exploitation. Tommy Martinez had evolved from a grief-stricken teenager into a formidable tactical planner, but his growing advocacy for preemptive strikes against zombie settlements put him at odds with survivors who believed such actions would only provoke more aggressive retaliation from increasingly powerful enemies. Dr. Rodriguez's research into the third evolutionary phase revealed that the pathogen was preparing to grant enhanced zombies capabilities that included improved communication systems, enhanced problem-solving abilities, and most disturbing of all, the capacity for rapid technological development that could allow them to create weapons and tools specifically designed to overcome human defensive advantages. The moral complexity of their situation deepened when Jessica Thompson established radio contact with her sister Patricia, who had been infected during the early stages of the outbreak but retained enough of her original personality to engage in coherent conversation about her experiences as an enhanced zombie. Patricia described the infection not as a disease but as an evolution that had freed her from human limitations while preserving her essential identity, though her casual discussion of hunting and consuming uninfected humans revealed how fundamentally the pathogen had altered her moral framework and emotional responses. This contact forced Jessica to confront the possibility that the enhanced zombies were not merely monsters wearing human faces but were genuinely evolved humans who had developed different values and survival strategies, making the conflict less about good versus evil and more about two incompatible species competing for the same ecological niche. Amy Chen found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about identity, consciousness, and what it truly meant to be human when faced with evidence that the infected retained memories, personalities, and relationships while operating under completely different moral and social systems. The approaching deadline for the pathogen's third evolutionary phase created urgent pressure for the survivors to make decisive strategic choices, as Dr. Rodriguez's projections indicated that enhanced zombies would soon possess technological capabilities that could make human resistance impossible through conventional means. David Washington advocated for a high-risk assault on the largest zombie settlement in downtown Atlanta, believing that disrupting their organizational structure before the next evolutionary leap might be humanity's last chance for victory, but other survivors worried that such an attack would unite all zombie factions against them and accelerate the very developments they were trying to prevent. Marcus Rivera recognized that traditional law enforcement approaches were inadequate for the unprecedented challenges they faced, leading him to embrace increasingly extreme tactics that would have horrified his pre-outbreak moral sensibilities but now seemed necessary for species survival. Rebecca Foster's analysis of zombie communication patterns revealed that the enhanced infected were aware of the survivors' internal debates and were using psychological pressure tactics designed to exploit their divisions and moral uncertainties, suggesting that the diplomatic overtures were part of a sophisticated strategy to weaken human resistance without requiring direct military confrontation. The psychological toll of making life-or-death decisions for their entire species pushed several survivors beyond their breaking points, with some advocating for acceptance of zombie terms while others demanded immediate evacuation from Atlanta to join larger human resistance movements in rural areas where the infected presence was supposedly less concentrated. Amy Chen realized that the group's unity was fracturing under the weight of impossible choices, forcing her to make difficult decisions about leadership and group dynamics that would determine not only their immediate survival but also their long-term effectiveness as a resistance cell. Tommy Martinez discovered that his tactical skills had attracted attention from zombie intelligence operatives who were attempting to recruit him through promises of enhanced capabilities and leadership positions in the emerging infected hierarchy, creating a temptation that tested his loyalty to humanity and his commitment to avenging his sister's transformation. Dr. Rodriguez faced the terrifying possibility that her research might be more valuable to the zombies than to human survivors, as her understanding of the pathogen's mechanisms could potentially be used to accelerate its evolution or create new variants designed to overcome human resistance strategies. The evening brought final intelligence reports indicating that zombie forces throughout the southeast were preparing for a coordinated offensive designed to eliminate all remaining human resistance before the third evolutionary phase reached completion, forcing the Atlanta survivors to choose between attempting a desperate preemptive strike or abandoning their stronghold for an uncertain future as refugees in an increasingly hostile world. The final battle for humanity's future began at dawn when Dr. Elena Rodriguez made the most difficult decision of her scientific career, choosing to weaponize her research by creating an electromagnetic pulse device that would disrupt the pathogen's third evolutionary phase but would also destroy the enhanced zombies' developing consciousness and potential for coexistence. David Washington led the assault team toward the primary zombie settlement in downtown Atlanta, knowing that their success or failure would determine whether humanity retained any hope of reclaiming their world or would be relegated to the status of an endangered species under zombie dominion. Marcus Rivera coordinated the operation from the Georgia World Congress Center, maintaining communication with survivor groups across the southeast who had agreed to launch simultaneous attacks on zombie strongholds, creating a coordinated offensive that represented humanity's last desperate gambit for survival. Amy Chen remained behind to protect the non-combatants and younger survivors, but her role as psychological counselor had evolved into something far more significant as she helped the group process the moral implications of what they were about to attempt, the systematic destruction of beings who had once been human and who had developed their own form of civilization and culture. Rebecca Foster's technological expertise proved crucial in the operation's opening phase, as she successfully deployed the electromagnetic pulse device that disrupted zombie communications across a 50-mile radius, creating chaos and confusion among the enhanced infected who had become dependent on their collective intelligence network for coordination and strategic planning. The immediate effect was more dramatic than anyone had anticipated, as zombies throughout the affected area reverted to more primitive behaviors, losing much of their tactical sophistication and organizational capability but retaining their enhanced physical abilities and fundamental drive to hunt human survivors. Tommy Martinez led the first assault wave against the primary zombie settlement, his tactical skills and intimate knowledge of urban combat environments allowing him to exploit the confusion created by the electromagnetic disruption. But the psychological cost of killing creatures who had once been neighbors and friends continued to weigh heavily on his conscience. Dr. Rodriguez monitored the pathogen's response to the electromagnetic interference, discovering that while the pulse had disrupted the third evolutionary phase, it had also triggered unexpected mutations that were creating new variants of the virus with unpredictable characteristics and capabilities. Jessica Thompson faced her most agonizing moment when she encountered her infected sister Patricia during the assault, finding that the electromagnetic pulse had partially restored Patricia's human memories and personality while leaving her with the physical characteristics and dietary requirements of an enhanced zombie. The brief reunion forced Jessica to confront the fundamental question of whether the infected deserved extermination or represented a new form of human evolution that could potentially coexist with uninfected populations, but the operational demands of the mission left no time for philosophical contemplation or emotional processing. David Washington's military experience proved invaluable as he adapted to the changing tactical situation, but even his extensive training had not prepared him for fighting enemies who retained enough human intelligence to recognize and exploit his strategic patterns while possessing physical capabilities that made conventional combat doctrines ineffective. The assault teams discovered that the zombie settlements contained not only military installations and resource production facilities but also primitive cultural artifacts and artistic expressions that suggested the enhanced infected had been developing their own unique civilization rather than simply mimicking human society. The battle reached its climax when Marcus Rivera realized that the electromagnetic pulse had created a narrow window of opportunity to capture rather than destroy the zombie leadership, potentially allowing Dr. Rodriguez to study the pathogen's effects on highly enhanced individuals and develop more targeted countermeasures for future encounters. Amy Chen coordinated a complex evacuation operation that involved not only protecting human survivors but also managing several captured enhanced zombies whose partial reversion to human consciousness created unprecedented ethical and practical challenges for the group's long-term survival strategy. Tommy Martinez proved his evolution from traumatized teenager to capable leader when he successfully negotiated a temporary ceasefire with a faction of partially reverted zombies who retained enough human morality to question their role in the broader conflict between the species. Rebecca Foster's analysis of the electromagnetic pulse's effects revealed that the device had not eliminated the pathogen but had instead reset its evolutionary timeline, potentially buying humanity several months to develop more effective countermeasures before the enhanced zombies could rebuild their organizational capabilities and resume their expansion. The immediate aftermath of the operation brought mixed results that reflected the complex nature of the conflict, as the assault teams had successfully disrupted zombie military capabilities but had also demonstrated that the enhanced infected possessed survival instincts and adaptive capabilities that made their complete elimination unlikely without weapons of mass destruction that would also devastate human survivors. Dr. Rodriguez found herself studying captured zombies who displayed a range of responses to the electromagnetic treatment, from complete reversion to human behavior to aggressive resistance that suggested some individuals had developed immunity to the pulse's effects. Jessica Thompson's reunion with her sister created a test case for potential human-zombie coexistence, as Patricia retained enough of her original personality to engage in meaningful communication while requiring carefully managed feeding protocols that challenged every assumption about post-outbreak morality and survival ethics. David Washington recognized that the military phase of the conflict had concluded with an uncertain outcome that left both species weakened and vulnerable, creating opportunities for diplomatic solutions that had been impossible during the height of zombie expansion and human resistance. The story concluded with Amy Chen addressing the combined group of human survivors and partially reverted zombies, acknowledging that the world had been permanently changed by the outbreak but that the electromagnetic pulse had created possibilities for coexistence that neither species had previously considered, setting the stage for a new phase of human evolution that would incorporate rather than eliminate the pathogen's effects while preserving the essential characteristics that defined humanity's identity and values in an uncertain future.